return of the king, in which Pippin, a young hobbit from the Shire, finds himself serving as an esquire to the lord of the most powerful city in all of Middle-earth. He feels utterly small and out of his element when the lord of the city makes an unexpected request. "Can you sing, Master Hobbit?" Pippin responds, "Well, yes, at least well enough for my own folk. But we have no songs for great halls and evil times." As he continues to gorge himself with food from his banquet table, Lord Denethor retorts, "And why should your songs be unfit for my halls? Come, sing me a song." And Pippin sings his most poignant song. Home is behind, the world is ahead, and there are many paths to tread, through shadow to the edge of night, until the stars are all alight. Mist and shadow, cloud and shade, all shall fade, all shall fade. That cinematic moment, poignant and powerful as it is, pales in comparison to the experience described in Psalm 137, a psalm that carries the subtitle, "Lament over the Destruction of Jerusalem." In 587 and 586, Jerusalem was besieged by the powerful Babylonian army. Many of its citizens starved to death within the walls before the Babylonian army finally breached the great wall that protected Jerusalem and unleashed violence and destruction without mercy. The city was flattened. The great temple, built by Solomon, cherished as the place where God chose to dwell among God's people, was stripped of all that was considered of value. Then it was leveled and burned until nothing remained. The leadership of the people were taken captive, those who were not killed, and they were forced into exile in Babylon. That is the backdrop of this prayer, this psalm, this song. In Babylon, the psalmist says, "Our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.'" It was an example of mockery and scorn, resulting in the only response that seemed possible. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This psalm represents and expresses the deepest and rawest of human emotions. For those who survived, who, having watched their own children die, wishing the same for their enemies, may not embody the principle of forgiveness, but it was a prayer of honest emotion before God. If not an example of how we should feel, it certainly was an example of how they felt. The ability of God's people to find in prayer a safe place for the inexpressible to be expressed allowed the tiny seed that remained of their faith to grow even in the most hostile of environments. A tiny seed that could still grow. In exile, the people of Israel would rediscover and rebuild their relationship with God. In exile, their religious leaders would compile their sacred story into written text for the first time. In exile with no temple to ground their religious life, their teachers would provide a new setting, the synagogue, as a center of worship life. In exile, they would remember the terror their minds could not erase, but also the treasure their hearts would never forget. In exile, their prophets would plant a seed of hope, and their faith, that tiny, fragile seed of faith, would allow them to grow as a people. A tiny seed, perhaps no larger than the tiniest mustard seed of which Jesus speaks. As we read in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was preaching and teaching at a time when God's people were also in need of redirection, a reordering of priorities, a refashioning of their lives, something to build on, something to strengthen their lives and their relationships with one another. In the backdrop of those brief 2 verses, Jesus has told them about the power of forgiveness. In fact, he has said to those who would listen, if your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times in one day, and each time he comes to you saying, I repent, you must forgive him. It's understandable that the disciples felt a little overwhelmed by that message. And so their cry to Jesus is, increase our faith. You're asking big things of us. We need a faith equal to the task. And Jesus tells them something else. He doesn't say, okay, I can do that. I'm going to increase your faith. And when your faith is big enough, then take the big problems. No, what Jesus says is faithful living isn't about storing up enough to get started. You have enough. All it takes is faith the size of a tiny, tiny mustard seed. All it takes is that tiny seed of faith. And you can change. You can make a difference. You can move a tree. You can change the world. I don't think he was really talking about mass transplanting of mulberry trees to seas near and far. He was talking about doing what seems impossible and letting the disciples know that however weak they felt, however small they believed their faith to be, they could make a difference. But they needed to start, even if starting means starting very, very small. Small steps, simple acts. Earlier this morning, I met with our confirmation class as we looked at the whole kind of sacrament of communion, but in the midst of that, I asked for their help this morning. And I asked them on a card, just a simple 2-sided